So how do you make the case for life after death and consciousness living outside the brain? My next guest did just that, winning a $500,000 grand prize in the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies essay contest, demonstrating that there are 9 lines of proof for the afterlife, including things like near-death and out-of-body experiences, mediumship, instrumental transcommmunication, reincarnation, possessions, and more. Jeffrey Mishlove joins me to talk about his winning essay and his case for proof of the afterlife on this episode of Passion for the Paranormal. Well, greetings, fellow truth seekers, and welcome once again to Passion for the Paranormal, bringing a passion for the paranormal to you. I'm your host, Curry Stegan, and happy 2023, everyone. I'm excited to bring in the new year with you. I hope 2023 is a better year for you than 2022. Certainly hope it is for me as well. Really excited for my next guest, Jeffrey Mishlove. Pretty amazing accomplishment that he was the grand prize winner of the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies essay contest. Grand prize of $500,000 he won, and there was 204 essays considered by that panel for that contest, and his won the number one prize. So that's an amazing accomplishment. I'm really excited to talk about how he made his case for life after death and was able to win the essay contest. And so it's going to be a really, really great interview and discussion. I think it's going to be an epic one. I think you're really going to enjoy it. If you haven't visited us at the website, you can visit us at passion4theparanormal.com, and also at Facebook at facebook.com/passion4theparanormal. And real excited to get into this discussion and interview with Jeffrey. And if you know of a family, friend, coworker, acquaintance that you think they'd like to check out the show, simply do me a favor and share a link with them and let them know about it. Make sure you hit that subscribe button on whatever podcast app you're using or however you're tuning into the show. Most of them have a way to be able to subscribe, so make sure you do that. And real eager to get into the discussion with Jeff. And once again, Happy New Year, everybody. And really hope you enjoy tonight's show. And thank you so much for tuning in. Okay, so my guest today is Jeffrey Mishlove. And Jeff earned a doctorate degree in Parapshychology from UC Berkley and was the grand prize winner of the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies essay contest, making the best case for life after death and consciousness outside the brain. His essay was entitled Beyond the Brain. He is author of the books The Roots of Consciousness, Psi Development Systems, and the PK Man, and is the host of the New Thinking Aloud show. Jeff, congratulations on winning the essay contest. It's a pretty amazing accomplishment, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Happy to be with you, Curry.
Yeah, and I believe there was over 200 essays reviewed in that contest, and so that's, you were in some impressive company with some of the other people who authored essays for that contest. What do you feel made yours stand out so much, and were there certain elements of it that you really felt like brought home the message of life after death and this conscious idea of consciousness outside the brain?
Well, there are, in my essay, 9 different approaches to life after death, independent lines of evidence, like reincarnation research, near-death experience, mediumship research, deathbed visions, and so on. Now, a lot of the essayists would point out that there are weaknesses in each individual area. And so some of the competitors even went so far as to say, we've got to do better than this because of all these weaknesses. But what I chose to do is suggest that if you take them all together, rather than look at the weaknesses, look at the strengths of these 9 different areas, all pointing to survival after death. It's what you would call in science an inductive argument, inductive logic, when you've got so many different directions of empirical evidence all pointing in the same direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the subjects that you cover in the essay are subjects I've covered on this show, anywhere from near death experiences, psychic and mediumship. Uh, some of the other things that are covered, I think, are spirit communications. And, I don't remember all the subjects, reincarnation. And there certainly is a lot of evidence out there. Is there something, you've researched this stuff for a long time, you've been involved in parapsychology. Is there one subject of the nine that you cover in the essay, is there one of them that is the most compelling to you?
Well, for any given person, what's going to be the most compelling are the experiences that they've had personally. You can read all the literature in the world, and there are certain skeptics who are very well versed in the literature, but if they haven't had a personal experience, sometimes it's just hard for them to swallow. So, in my case, and in the case of several other individuals that I write about, I had an experience that literally changed my life pretty much 180 degrees. That happened in 1972 when I was a young person at the age of 25 years old. And I was a graduate student at the time in the School of Criminology at Berkeley. If you had known me then, you would have seen a young person doing volunteer work at San Quentin Prison in the psychiatric unit, conducting group therapy sessions with murderers and rapists. And that's when I had a dream. I call it a visitation. It was lucid. It was more real than real, in which a great uncle of mine appeared, and it was a soul to soul communion so powerful that when I awakened from that dream, I was just crying tears of joy and simultaneously singing a very sacred song in my religious background. And it's never happened to me before or since. And it was that experience that motivated me to change my career focus dramatically and create, as you mentioned, a unique academic program in parapsychology. So I felt that this experience was so powerful. I had to easily worth devoting my whole life to trying to figure out what it was about. And uh, that's what other people have done too. Bishop Pike in California was the Episcopal bishop of the state of California, a very prominent position when his son died of suicide. And he began communicating with his deceased son through mediums. And as a result, he resigned as Bishop of California. Another famous example is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who is now regarded as one of the 100 most influential people of the 20th century. She was doing workshops on death and dying at the University of Chicago and was very disheartened. Her work seemed to be going nowhere. She was about to quit when a woman appeared she was standing by the elevator about to resign, talking to a minister she was working with. A woman appeared and said, "Can I walk with you to your office?" And as they're walking together, she sees the woman and realizes this is Mrs. Schwartz. Mrs. Schwartz was the woman who first informed her about near-death experiences, and she was one of the first to write about it back in 1975. However, Mrs. Schwartz had died 10 months prior. She realized she's walking next to a deceased woman. And Mrs. Schwartz turns to her, looks at her with the same intensity I felt during my dream of Uncle Harry, and says to her, "You must promise me not to give up this work." Elizabeth Kubler-Ross made that promise and had the presence of mind to ask the Mrs. Schwartz, "Would you mind writing a note for me?" Which she did. She wrote a note, and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross kept that note and used to hold it up in her lectures. After that, Mrs. Schwartz walked out of the office where they had been. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross opened the door to look after her, but there was no one there in the hallway.
Wow.
So These kinds of experiences can totally change your life. Now, that's going to convince you no matter how you happen to be disposed intellectually.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of how it happened for me as well. Now, if you want to maybe perhaps go back and before you started this journey in parapsychology, would you have classified yourself as perhaps a cynic or maybe a skeptic prior to that experience?
Well, okay, let's go back to 1968, 4 years earlier. I was an undergraduate in psychology at the University of Wisconsin, and I decided to write a senior honors thesis on the psychology of religious mysticism. And my goal at that time was to write about all the different forms of psychopathology that cause a person to imagine that they're seeing ghosts and having mystical experiences. However, while I was working on that project, I came across the writing of Abraham Maslow, a great psychologist. He wrote a book called Toward a Psychology of Being. And he wrote about what he called peak experiences, that he interviewed the most successful people in our culture, people like Albert Einstein and Eleanor Roosevelt. And they all reported having these peak experiences. And he said, these experiences are central to the success of these people. It molds their whole life. And then he added, and they're indistinguishable from mystical experiences. And when I read that, I realized I have to change my attitude about it. So then it was about 1969 when I realized you can't just dismiss mysticism out of hand, but it's a far cry from having that realization to being willing to devote your whole life's career to the study of these things.
Certainly. And let's talk a little bit about parapsychology. Now, first of all, you were the first or the only to earn a doctoral degree in parapsychology in the United States. Is that correct?
Well, technically, it's correct. I'm the only person to have a doctoral diploma from an accredited university, probably in the world, that says parapsychology on the diploma. But to be fair, there are actually hundreds of people who have done doctoral level research on and dissertations on parapsychological topics. So what's unique in my case is that I created an individual interdisciplinary program of my own design. And so I defined parapsychology not merely as a branch of experimental psychology, but rather as a discipline in and of itself that has an ancient history going back to the yoga, for example, thousands of years ago, and the mystical traditions of all cultures. So I included all of that in my definition of parapsychology.
And I guess what I would ask is, are you kind of taken aback or a little bit surprised that, we're kind of moving into a new direction now? I mean, you're seeing paranormal shows left and right on TV, radio and podcast shows about paranormal related topics. Yet science is still really, in large part, it seems like, has not accepted this. They kind of treat it as a pseudoscience, if you will. Are you kind of surprised by that? And do you think there's been some progress being made now?
Well, let's be really clear about it. What you got is a bunch of, I'm going to be crude, but a bunch of loudmouth scoffers who say this is a pseudoscience. However, the Parapsychological Association, which is the official organization of scientific parapsychology, has been an affiliate of the American Association for the Advancement of Science since 1969. There are now over, I would say, 1,400 refereed peer-reviewed articles published in scientific journals of parapsychological data. Recently, the American Psychological Association published an article summarizing all of this data and concluding that the evidence is overwhelming in favor of paranormal phenomena. Now, unfortunately, even after 40 years, I have a unique degree. It's very hard to study parapsychology. The loudmouth scoffers have a lot of influence because people in academia, people in the scientific establishments are afraid of being laughed at. And that's the weapon that the scoffers use, the horse laugh. Hardy, har, har, har. So you believe in all of this childish nonsense. So what you got is I would have to say it's akin to the small percentage of people in our culture who support the presidency of the former president. They're a minority, but they carry a lot of weight nonetheless.
Yeah, and it seems that we're slowly moving in the right direction, where people are maybe perhaps becoming more accepting of paranormal phenomena, if you will. Do you kind of see where we're going in culture today as kind of a positive? I mean, I mentioned we've got all paranormal shows. Some of them are obviously a little bit dramatic and Hollywoodized, but kind of where do you see where we're at today, and do you see that as kind of a positive, or that we're moving in the right direction?
I think you have to appreciate that we've had basically a materialistic culture since roughly the 1600s, pretty much since the late Renaissance. Our culture has been mechanistic, materialistic, and of course, science has shown us enormous progress. So, for a culture to change is a slow thing. It doesn't happen overnight, it happens over centuries. And I think we're at a turning point. You can see, for example, it was just, I think, last year that the US government, in fact, no, we're still in 2022. It was this year that the US government finally acknowledged that our military, our Navy in particular, has had confirmed sightings of what used to be called flying saucers or UFOs. That's big. The government had been pretty much denying it for half a century. Now the governments of the world are officially researching it with the support of the United States government and the United States Congress. That's a huge sea change that we're right in the middle of, or right on the cusp of.
I'm glad you mentioned the UFO subject. UFO, and some now want to say UAP with all this new videos that have come out, the unclassified videos. What do you see? Do you see this subject? I mean, there's when I say this subject, you can get into a lot of different things. Not just sightings of strange craft, but the rabbit hole can go pretty deep. I've covered this subject pretty extensively on this show, had a lot of UFO researchers on, and you can get all the way down the rabbit hole into alien abductions. But do you see a tie-in here on the subject of UFOs, UAPs to consciousness and to this whole other subjects we're talking about today?
Well, over 20 years ago, I published a book called The PK Man, based on a 10-year field study that I did with a man named Ted Owens, who exhibited extraordinary powers of precognition and psychokinesis that he attributed to telepathic contact with alien beings that he called the space intelligences. So I've been documenting this connection now for a long time.
It's interesting because you do have a lot of UFO researchers are out there that are kind of more your nuts and bolts researchers, and then you have some that are kind of expanding their research into consciousness and how maybe perhaps this phenomena relates to it. And I'm just kind of would like to get your take on it. Are you kind of in that camp where you think that we kind of need to expand our view of the phenomena and how perhaps it links with consciousness?
Well, yes, I would say that I'm pretty much in agreement with Jacques Vallée, one of the foremost UFO researchers in the world, who notes the connection between various alien encounters and the mythologies of all cultures. One of my professors at Berkeley was James Harder. He was an engineer who was the research director for an organization no longer active currently, called the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization. And he suggested from his interviews with contactees that there may be alien beings who have a lifespan of 20,000 years and who have been on this planet interacting with humans for a very long time. You've also got the case of Uri Geller, plus the case I explored of Ted Owens, people who demonstrate psychokinetic powers, who openly acknowledge that these powers that they can demonstrate are connected with contactee experiences that they themselves have had with some form of alien intelligence. And by alien, I don't necessarily mean from another planet. Alien simply the way I'm using the term would be non-human.
Yes, and it's interesting because none of us really truly seem to have the answers. I know some people think the government's got all the answers out there. It doesn't seem like to me that anybody really truly has the bigger picture here about what's going on. But it is interesting to see that you have kind of more the nuts and bolts researchers out there that, they don't want to explore or expand into areas like alien abductions. And, they're more of the scientific approach to this. And then, there seems to be a lot of other researchers out there that are expanding their view on this to include some of the areas that we're talking about today, which kind of leads me to my next question. You cover a lot of subjects in the book. You said 9 different topic areas. I've written down a few of them here, and I'll mention a few of them. One is near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, instrumental transcommunication, mediumship, psychokinesis. Is there any one area here? I know I kind of asked this already, but you've done research into these areas. Is there any one area here that one is the most interesting to you and one that you've really enjoyed researching the most?
Well, I would say this, Curry. One of the standards that I hold to is what I call high strangeness. Most people, with regard to high strangeness, they just shove it under the rug. It's like so bizarre, it's unbelievable. But I think from a scientific point of view, the things that are so bizarre that you simply can't believe them may be the very most important. And I'll give you one example. Back in the 1920s, there was a famous medium. In fact, she was one of the most famous people in the United States back then. She was known as Marjorie the medium. Her real name was Minna Crandon. She was the wife of a Harvard professor. And she performed feats of mediumship that were really quite extraordinary. And she was tested at Harvard University. They said that it seemed quite legitimate. And Scientific American magazine was about to give her an award of $5,000, which was a lot of money back then, as the first person to demonstrate spirit phenomena when she encountered one of these, I'll have to call him again, a loudmouth scoffer, the magician Harry Houdini. Now, who tried as hard as he could to debunk her. Her phenomena that she produced, and you can research, you'll see photographs of ectoplasm emerging from her body, a strange substance emerging from her body while she's in a hypnotic trance. She claimed, if you study her mediumship, that the powers that she had were the result of a spirit she was working with, which was her deceased younger brother, Walter Stinson, who died in, if I recall correctly, a railroad accident in 1911 or so. After her mediumship ended in disgrace, I think she died as an alcoholic because she was so ridiculed and shamed. Walter Stinson, this as a spirit, began appearing through other mediums in Canada, in Winnipeg, Canada, producing similar phenomena, bizarre phenomenon like ectoplasm, which was photographed at the time. And then again, producing similar phenomena witnessed and photographed in England by a medium there, Stuart Alexander. So what you've got here seems to be the persistence of a particular deceased individual named Walter Stinson through 3 different mediums in 3 different countries, producing similar, remarkable, unbelievable phenomena, well documented, photographed, and witnessed independently by various scientists. To me, that's quite significant.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to move on to what I think is one of the most compelling subject areas, and that is near-death experiences. And I know you write about it in your essay. What, for you, has been the most compelling aspect of near-death experiences and has led you into researching that?
Well, in a way, the near-death experiences are the most profound emotionally, because these people who have been touched, it's very similar to my dream of Uncle Harry. They have experienced, they often come back and say, a level of love and universal acceptance far beyond any kind of human love. Their lives are changed. From a scientific point of view, the evidence is weaker because, after all, they're still alive. You have to say, they didn't necessarily die. It's a near-death experience, not an actual death experience, although there may be some dispute. I tend to think that the reports of near-death experiencers represent what you might call the first stages of the afterlife, the early stages of the afterlife. We have, on the other hand, in the mediumistic literature, accounts of deceased individuals who have been dead for years, like the famous psychical researcher F.W.H. Myers, who wrote Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death. It was published in 1903, the year after he died. But for the next 30 years or so, he began appearing through different automatic writers and describing what the afterlife was like, including a complete book he dictated called The Road to Immortality, that was transcribed by an automatic writer in England named Geraldine Cummins. It goes into great detail about the different levels and stages of the afterlife. So we have intersecting accounts from different perspectives, from both the near-death experiencers and from spirits apparently communicating through mediums and automatic writers and the like, who have been on the other side for quite a while.
Right. And do you see a lot of consistency in the accounts of NDEs, people who have experienced near-death experiences?
Yes, there is a lot of consistency, and at the same token, each account is unique. Each account is different, just like every person is unique. So there are both similarities and differences, and will always be that way. You can imagine if you had 10 different friends who went to Paris and came back and told you what Paris was like, you would get 10 different unique accounts.
Yeah, I want to talk about some of the consistencies. What are the ones, some of the big consistent things you've seen from people who have had these accounts, whether it be some sort of tunnel? What other things that have really stood out to you in terms of consistencies?
Well, again, primarily it's this overwhelming sense of love for most people. Now, roughly 5% of near-death experiencers actually report hellish experiences. So there's that too. Oftentimes, I tend to suspect that those individuals are harboring guilt. And so what often you encounter in the early stages of the afterlife seems to be you're moving into what Carl Jung would call, the great Swiss psychiatrist, the collective unconscious of humanity in a way. You're moving into Jung. Jung said that the afterlife and the unconscious are the same. He wrote about visitations in his dream experiences and in what he called active imagination, where he encountered the dead that way. That we're really talking about ultimately the nature of the human psyche itself, which is very diverse, very complex. What could be vaster than the human mind? Nevertheless, there are patterns. And some of those patterns are, well, you could say the human psyche itself ranges from the polarities between good and evil, to the most evil possible to the highest good possible, or in religious terms, from God to Satan, something along those lines. Most individuals are are filled with goodness for the most part, but a tiny percentage of people are, deeply engaged in criminality. I've certainly encountered that in my life. And I think even those people are ultimately in the afterlife loved. However, they're, at a deep level, they're filled with guilt. And that guilt will manifest as they enter the afterlife. People judge themselves more harshly, I think, than we are judged by the divine.
Yeah, and I think I've heard the expression, sometimes we create our own hell. So perhaps it's kind of, likens to that.
Yeah, John Milton in the Renaissance, the great poet who wrote Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, said, there is neither heaven nor hell, but the mind makes it so.
Right, and yeah, this is powerful stuff. And one of the other subject areas I wanted to talk about is reincarnation. I've had guests on the show, whether they're psychics or mediums, or they've kind of researched the topic as well, whether it be near-death experience, reincarnation. What, in terms of reincarnation, did you find so compelling?
The way I view it is that for example, the University of Virginia, they've been researching cases of reincarnation for 50 years. They have in their database 2,700 cases of young children who, almost as soon as they can begin to speak, begin talking about having lived previously a human life. And in 1,700 of those cases are considered solved, which means that the information provided by these young children is sufficiently detailed that researchers are able to identify who the previous person was. So that doesn't mean that everybody experiences or will experience reincarnation, but it certainly suggests that's an option in terms of the journey of the soul. And for all we know, it's more common than not.
Yeah, it's there are certainly many interesting cases out there, and the one that comes to mind, and for some reason always comes to mind, is and the name escapes me, but the young child who recounted being a World War II Navy pilot.
Meininger.
And, I'm sorry?
Leininger is
Yes, that one is quite a fascinating case. And there's a few others out there. Well, there's several others. I know you mentioned some of them, but that one kind of stands out to me. There's some others that people have taken on marks that seem to be connected to a previous life. What have you found out about that?
Well, yes, Ian Stevenson, who founded the program at the University of Virginia, has written a couple of books about reincarnation and biology. One of the interesting facts about reincarnation is that a very high percentage, I think 40% of the cases, are ones in which the previous person died violently. That may have something to do with the recall. And oftentimes there are autopsy records of the previous person's death. And the young children are born with birthmarks and sometimes deformities. And in a very high percentage of these cases, the birthmarks and deformities of the young children correspond to the death wounds of the previous person.
Yeah, it's
physical evidence.
Yeah, it's remarkable. It truly is. Some of these cases that have been researched and written about. I want to move on to the topic of, I guess you could say, spirit communication. I think you mentioned in the essay, instrumental transcommunication.
Yeah.
There's an individual, and I will probably murder his name. I think he's considered many consider him the father of electronic voice phenomena.
Yes.
And that would be Konstantin Radiv. And I think, again, I probably murdered the name. Latvian, considered a scientist, but really, researched and delved into this instrumental transcommunication, EVPs, and documented a lot of this. What have you kind of found from your research into this type of spirit communication?
Yeah, Konstantin Raudive died, as I recall, in 1973 after he wrote a book about electronic voice communication, or EVP, sometimes also called instrumental transcommunication, or ITC. His book was called Breakthrough, and he devoted a large portion of his adult life to researching it. Then, after he died, he began appearing to other people. There are today tens of thousands of hobbyists using computers and radios and televisions as devices for communication with the other side. And Raudive himself has appeared to as many as 100 of these hobbyists. And he has this distinctive voice with a Latvian accent that comes through in multiple instances. I regard this as some of the strongest evidence. Now, you see it all the time on these various paranormal TV shows. They have things called the ghost box and other recording devices that they use. For the most part, you wonder whether it's real. It seems like, this could be random noises that people are projecting. They imagine that they're hearing. The technical term for that is apophenia, where you project onto a random sound something that seems meaningful. But in the best cases, the voices of Raudive and others are unmistakable, lengthy discourses. And I regard this as some of the strongest proof for the existence of consciousness after death, because it's not mediated by a living individual, except to the extent that I do think the hobbyists who are most successful at it seem to have a kind of mediumistic gift. Nevertheless, the voices appear on electronic communication, sometimes in devices that are not even plugged in, and can be recorded. It's similar to a mediumistic phenomenon known as direct voice. Marjorie, the medium, was gifted at this, the woman from the 1920s. They did research where they would hold seances and they would put an instrument in the mouth of every participant that measured the airflow in and out of the mouths. So you could tell whether anybody in the seance room was speaking or if they had removed the instrument. All of that would be recorded, and voices would appear in the middle of the room. Sometimes these voices could be recorded on tape. They're just like coming out of nowhere and communicating very lengthy and intelligible messages. And I regard this as very strong evidence for survival.
Yeah, I'm paranormal investigator. Been doing it for a number of years now, and that is the majority of, I would say, if you want to call it evidence that I've captured. Video evidence is pretty sparse. What's kind of your thought on that? Do you think there's much video evidence out there of it, or do you think the audio side of it is probably the most compelling?
Well, I haven't followed all the literature carefully. I know there's some examples of video images that appear quite distinct and resemble photographs of the deceased communicators. So I wouldn't discount the video images. I'm under the impression it's not easy to do from the other side, that it takes a lot of concentration, a lot of energy, maybe even a team of people working on the other side in order to produce these effects. Well, in my broadcast career, I've done both radio and television, and obviously television is more difficult. So it's probably the same thing from the other side in that regard. The best evidence that I'm aware of was conducted by a Portuguese diplomat, Anabela Cardoso, former diplomat, who worked in an acoustical science laboratory in Spain, so that the room was shielded, electrically shielded, so there could be no stray radio signals interfering with the equipment. And even in that situation, anomalous voices were produced. But for the most part, you've got hobbyists working, and they're not working under rigorous scientific conditions. So the results are harder to interpret for that reason.
Yeah, certainly, and there's plenty of us in paranormal enthusiasts and hobbyists and investigators, as we like to use that term. I think a lot of us, but you're right. I mean, we can't create rigorous scientific conditions for recording these things. We're not scientists, but a lot of us think we have a pretty compelling case for that. Some of these voices are not any of ours. I certainly have captured a number of them over the years of doing paranormal investigation. I wanted to move on to another subject that I think you also cover in the essay. You've also written about, and it's another fascinating topic, and that's the topic of psychokinesis. And can you touch on a little bit about that and your research into it?
Well, the interest in psychokinesis goes back to the 1930s. J.B. Rhine at Duke University did studies with a dice throwing machine to see if people could concentrate on the dice, as you might in the game of craps, to get the right dice to come up. And he found statistically significant results. Rhine then expanded his research to look at things like basketball games at Duke University, like when the ball is rolling around in the hoop, whether it's going to go in or come out, and you've got a whole crowd of hometown fans there, does the ball go into the basket more often for the home team in those situations? So it's very creative. Then in the 1970s, I was one of the first people to engage in demonstrations with Uri Geller, the Israeli psychic, who began showing that he could concentrate on spoons and they'd start to melt right in his hand. And we'd bring Uri onto the radio station where I was working in those days, and hundreds of people in the audience would call in reporting when they hear him doing it, it happens in their homes. They used to call these people the mini Gellers. There were thousands of them all over the world. And then, of course, I wrote the book called The PK Man. PK is the abbreviation for psychokinesis, which is the parapsychological term for mind over matter. Sometimes it's called telekinesis, but another extension of that is what you could call distant mental influence on living systems, or psychic healing. I think of as a form of psychokinesis. So there's a lot of evidence to this effect. Even, for example, my friend, the late Elizabeth Rauscher, working with biophysicist Beverly Rubik, conducted a study with a famous healer named Olga Worrell, where they had bacteria inside of a test tube, and they would put in a solution of detergent, which kills the bacteria, and ask Olga Worrell from thousands of miles distant to try and send healing energy into the test tube so the bacteria would survive. And lo and behold, they got significant results at that. So it appears that time and space are not obstacles either to extrasensory perception nor to psychokinesis. That really confounds the scoffers. They figure if time and space can't prevent these effects, then they must not exist at all, because everything we know about physics suggests that time and space are obstacles. Radio signals, for example, get weaker and weaker the further they go, because they spread out. So we're obviously dealing with phenomena that defy traditional physical laws. That doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means we have to begin to think more broadly about how they can occur. What theory would explain such phenomena?
I wanted to also talk about, because parapsychology also gets into phenomena like poltergeists, possessions, these sorts of phenomena. With regard to poltergeists, there is kind of a theory out there that there is some sort of, and this ties into what we were just talking about before, kind of the psychokinesis, if you will, that people's, mind projections can perhaps result in some of this types of paranormal or poltergeist type phenomena, objects moving and that sort of thing. What say you about the research into psychokinesis and how it ties into the poltergeist?
Yeah, parapsychologists have used the term RSPK to define poltergeist. That means random or recurring spontaneous psychokinesis. And it can occur in a home, for example, and the cases can be very dramatic and very disturbing. What is the cause? That's tricky, because in some of these cases, naturally, in all of them, when a research comes in, they have to rule out fraud. And it's not always easy to do, because you're not in a laboratory. You're in somebody's home, typically, and often it's a home where there are young children who may be mischievous and like to play tricks. And are you going to keep an eye on all of them at once? I think there are cases in which young children have been caught trying to fake psychokinetic activity. But that aside, there are also cases in which young children, particularly teenagers, are emotionally disturbed. And it would seem as if like in the movie Carrie is a good example, a young teenager emotionally disturbed, and the emotional disturbance projects itself out in the form of psychokinetic activity that seems to center around the young person. And often the phenomenon go away after the young teenage individual gets a bit of counseling and therapy. On the other hand, it also seems as if there are cases of poltergeist activity. Poltergeist, incidentally, is a German word. It means noisy ghost. The poltergeist activity may be associated with an independent, autonomous spirit agency that might sometimes actually possess the inhabitants of a house, and they'll go into a trance state and start speaking in tongues or speaking in ways that are not what you would expect from their normal personality. They're showing signs of possession. So we can't rule that out either. There's no need to assume that every case of poltergeist activity has a similar origin. There may be multiple origins for these cases, but there's no question that they do in fact occur. They've been documented very carefully by researchers. Oftentimes you'll find things like apports, stones, for example, dropping from the ceiling, and people get plagued by this. It can be very uncomfortable to be in a house that is infested, you might say, by this kind of activity.
Yeah, and in regards to possessions, is there any cases that you've looked into or researched that you found there was some compelling evidence for?
There are about a dozen cases of possession that have been researched. William James, who was considered the founder of American psychology, in his classic book of psychology, published, if I recall, 1893, I think it was, reports on a case of possession known as the Watseka Wonder. It took place in the town of Watseka, Illinois, and in which a young girl named Mary Roth was experiencing what they called in those days fits. And it seems as if she became possessed by the spirit of a different young lady who had died 10 years previously to a different family who lived across town. That was Mary Roth. The woman who was possessed was named Laurence Venom. He became possessed by the spirit of Mary Roth. Mary Roth didn't even recognize the parents of Laurence Venom, but she recognized the parents of in the Roth family, went to live with them for 3 months, and then she said, "It's time for me to go," and she left, and Laurence Venom returned to her own body, perfectly restored, no longer subject to fits, whatever they were. So researchers tend to think of these cases as examples of what they sometimes call replacement reincarnation. In other words, instead of being reincarnated into a fetus or into an infant, one gets reincarnated into the body of an adult or an older child, sometimes permanently, sometimes temporarily. There are cases in which there's a famous case in India called the Shiva Sumitra case. Sumitra was a married woman with 2 children. She fell ill. The family thought she was dead. They were getting ready to cremate the body when all of a sudden she woke up, but it was a different person entirely who remained in the body for 13 years and had different mannerisms, a different level of education, and convinced her original family that she was that person. She had been murdered in another village like the year before. So yes, cases of possession have been carefully researched, and I would call them among the strongest evidence we have for survival.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I'm glad you mentioned those cases because there's nothing there about perhaps what some may call demonic possession. There are other cases out there for that, but the cases you mentioned appear to be where it's something that was once living that is perhaps inhabiting another person. Anything along the lines of some may call demonic type possessions.
Yeah, I'm often puzzled by the very term demonic. You know, it comes out of a religious tradition. There's a whole mythology about fallen angels and such. I have some scientific colleagues who say it's simply not a term that is meaningful in a scientific context whatsoever. However, in a psychotherapeutic context, you do encounter people who seem to be possessed by an energy that could be described as demonic, you know, hateful, spiteful, vindictive. Uh, Oftentimes, the psychotherapists who work in this area um, tend to see such entities as deceased individuals, perhaps of a criminal nature, deceased individuals hanging out in what the esoteric traditions would call the lower astral planes. On the other hand, you know, there is a lot of lore about angels and demons. I wouldn't want to discount it entirely. I think we have to pay attention to the spiritual traditions as well, but there's very little in the scientific literature, practically nothing that could confirm the existence of either angels or demons in a theological sense.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Thank you for commenting on that. I appreciate that. Yeah, we're a little bit short on time, Jeff. What's kind of on the radar for you here in the next year or so? Are you working? I think you mentioned another essay you're working on. Any more books? Anything like that?
I'm really quite active. The New Thinking Aloud channel on YouTube. That's New Thinking Aloud, all one word. And aloud is ALLOWED, not the other aloud. And we upload 3, 4, 5 interviews on YouTube every week. At the same time, we're about to launch a new magazine. We've got a contract with White Crow Books in England to launch a series of books based on the New Thinking Aloud interviews. Our first book, called Do We Survive Death, will be released in early next year. And you mentioned another essay. Well, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, located in California, is sponsoring a new essay competition to design an experiment that could potentially falsify the conventional scientific notion that consciousness is a creation of the brain. So I'm working on that essay now too.
Great. Well, it sounds like you keep yourself really busy in your work. Where can people find out more about you and the work you do, your books, all that?
Well, once again, I would recommend the New Thinking Aloud Foundation. The YouTube channel is newthinkingaloud.com, and the foundation is newthinkingaloud.org. And we publish a weekly newsletter for free. It includes not only previews of all of our interviews for the coming week, it also includes artwork, poetry, news items. I'll certainly post an announcement about your interview in our newsletter, and people can sign up for that for free at the New Thinking Aloud Foundation website.
Great, Jeff. Thank you so much for spending the time to talk with me today. Again, congratulations on your selection as the grand prize winner in the BICS essay contest. Again, that's pretty remarkable. And best of luck in all your future endeavors and work. And once again, thank you for spending the time with me.
You're very welcome, Curry. It's a pleasure to connect with you.
All right. Have a great night.